right, looks like we're now live for the AMA for March 2024. So good to see you here, Mark. We've already got one question lined up, and it's a good one, although I think has some ambiguities and big presuppositions built into it that we'll talk about in a minute. I'll just say I just came off of a great class session in my Stoicism and the Cardinal Virtues class, talking about the virtue of wisdom in considerable depth from what we've got in the Stoic text. So that was quite a lot of fun. Had some great questions from the participants. We got about 15 students enrolled in that class. All right, so Lapse 9 Continuum, a longtime attendee and subscriber. Do you think philosophy can make progress in any sense on hard metaphysical questions? If so, is it valuable? So progress, that's an ambiguous term, and it doesn't mean the same thing to same people. So it's one of those questions where we probably would have to say, well, what do we mean by this? Do we mean that like there's something like consensus among all the practitioners or most of the practitioners within a field? Because then you don't get much progress, not only in philosophy, but in any of the humanities or the social sciences or, a lot of other things as well, fields that we often take quite seriously, like law or business or things like that. So if that's what we mean, and we're modeling it off of mathematics or the natural sciences, which themselves, sometimes go backwards and forwards, no, there's not going to be any progress. But in that case, why would we care, right? So we have to mean something different by progress in that case. Like, can we show that there's a development of better argued or more thought out ideas? And then when you look at the history of philosophy, and you don't do so by going to philosophy textbooks or websites or stuff like that, but actually like read through things, yeah, you can see people progressing. And we see this in all sorts of ways. I mean, we know even with what we got of the Stoic texts that there's, progress in developing ideas. Like, what does it mean to be in accordance with nature? The ideas get more complex. Now, hard metaphysical questions, no consensus on that either. There's parochial consensus. So you ask an analytic philosopher, what's the hard metaphysical question, right? And they may agree with other analytic philosophers on that, but you ask a history of philosophy person or somebody doing something in one of the various continental schools, and they may have different ideas about what the hard questions are. So I don't know that that's particularly helpful either. But I think there is progress. But if there's progress in philosophy, it's going to be of a different sort than, say, progress in physics. So we would want to figure out, what do we actually mean by progress in those cases? All right, let's see what the next question is. John, how do you understand Heidegger's different kind of thinking discussed in works like what is called Thinking, the End of Philosophy, and the Task of Thinking, the interview Only a God Can Save Us? I don't know, because I don't really read that stuff too much. I'm much more focused on, stuff like this, early and middle works of Heidegger. So he's had all sorts of different kinds of thinking, but I don't have much to say about that. Black Prairie, I'm planning on jumping into existentialism. Should I start with the second sex or being and nothingness? I've already read existentialism as a humanism. I mean, if you're going to jump into existentialism, I don't know why you'd start with either of those. Those are rather late works. Why wouldn't you begin with earlier thinkers like the 19th century thinkers like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, and some people consider Ibsen and Tolstoy, like, the Death of Ivan Ilyich, to be existentialist stuff. Certainly the later existentialist thinkers are influenced by those early thinkers. And then, there's all sorts of people along the way before you get to Sartre and de Beauvoir, including Heidegger, and Jaspers and Lev Shestov, and great literary works. So I would actually start at the beginning of, you know, the 19th century and read your way forward rather than just, you know, picking Sartre and de Beauvoir. Um, so let's see. Salaf Salahuddin says love from Pakistan for inspiring people like me who love philosophy. Okay, so that's great. Yeah, it must be pretty late right now over there, I imagine, right? Time zone wise. So, um, what's maybe 11 o'clock or so? Thanks for joining for that. That's kind of cool. So, Boomer Anderson, what's your approach to kindness? So, you know, it's an underrated virtue or aspect of virtue that I think a lot of people tend to leave out. And kindness is quite important for us to cultivate. Interestingly, you know, or I just mentioned that I'm teaching a class on Stoicism and the cardinal virtues. A lot of people don't realize that kindness or benevolence is actually one half of justice, according to Cicero, who's, you know, uh, articulating an orthodox Stoic perspective on that. And if you read through ancient and medieval philosophy, you will find that there's lots and lots of discussions about kindness, generosity, benevolence, all those sorts of things. It often gets left out by um, approaches that want to think just in terms of like rules or rights or stuff like that. But kindness is an incredibly important part of our life. JB, good to see you here, says, I remember Massimo Pigliucci talking about progress in philosophy in terms of ideas that had been discarded. I found that pretty persuasive, though discarded ideas can always be revived. Some are like discarded and rightly so, and probably never will be revived except by crackpots. But yeah, there's cases where we're like, well, why did we stop thinking this way when actually this is pretty good, you know? Um, the revival of Stoicism, not the sort of like, you know, put up a bunch of quotes and pretend like taking cold showers makes you stoic kind of stuff, but you know, actually like studying it, that can be quite important. Here's a book along those lines. Lawrence Becker's A New Stoicism, where he actually says, I'm going to, you know, think about this book. What would actually have been the case if Stoicism never went away, right? Let's do a sort of hypothetical, and then he brings up some really useful ideas that he draws on critically from the Stoics. So yeah, sometimes we do bring back old ideas. Somebody else, by the way, who I think is great in talking about coming back to this issue on progress in philosophy, Alistair McIntyre. You know, he thinks that it is possible to make progress and to have decline, to go backwards in philosophy as well. So, all right, Black Prairie. Oh, what works of Kierkegaard would you recommend for beginners? So I teach an existentialism class, and it's for non-philosophy majors. It's at a Institute of Art and Design here in Milwaukee, and the two pieces that I start them with are "The Crowd is Untruth" and the second part of the two ages, which we call the present age. And I've done videos on those, which you can find. They're hopefully a useful resource for people. And then I usually have them read parts of Fear and Trembling to get, you know, it's a broader, more systematic kind of work. But we don't always do all of it. But I mean, those are good. Also, The Sickness Unto Death. If you can get yourself past the first page, where you know the self is a relation to the relation, it gets all kind of crazy and confusing. If you can get past that, that's a pretty good one for approaching Kierkegaard's work as well. Um, I can't reach and grab Kierkegaard because he's way up on that shelf over there. But you know, I wouldn't suggest like beginning with either or because it's a big, thick, dense work. You know, Actually, I also really like, and I think it's pretty accessible, the uh, Johannes Climacus stuff. I'm blanking on the name. I want to say Philosophical Investigations, but that's Wittgenstein. But it's about the range of philosophy as well. All right, Alligator. Do you think Green Bay will make the Super Bowl next year? I mean, do I think they will? No. Do I hope they will? I mean, hope springs eternal, especially if you grew up in the 1970s and 80s when the Packers sucked and disappointed us. You come out being the kind of fan who, really sticks by their team. And that's the case for both me and my wife. I mean, Jordan Love really surprised people this year. He's turned out to be a great quarterback and actually a decent person. Certainly a improvement morally and team wise over the previous two star quarterbacks of Brett Favre and Aaron Rodgers. So they've got a pretty good future ahead, but so much depends on all these other factors that are like totally out of your control, like the other players and how well the team gels and management and what the schedule looks like. So, I'm just happy to see them doing well. And, you know, by the way, the Packers are not the only team that I root for. I also root for the Bears, except when they're playing the Packers, and the Colts as well. So, all right. Christophus, is there a text of philosophy you return to read when you feel down? Um, no, there isn't. That's an interesting question. Um, I mean, I've always got so much going on in terms of what I'm reading. For example, I'm right now rereading World as Will and Representation because I've got a client that I'm working through the text with. Um, and just the act of actually reading is good for me. I'm also, here's a Plutarch because I'm teaching Plutarch next week. Two of his texts, How to Tell a Flatterer from a Friend and On Having Many Friends. So I don't have like a go-to consoling book, but the act of reading can be helpful. But I also like reading speculative fiction. So, or certain poets like Rilke. Rilke's a go-to for me because he has such profound ideas about death and those we've loved and nature and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, I might read. So right now, I'm actually reading, getting ready for the Worlds of Speculative Fiction. I'm reading the Dresden Files, the first four novels by Jim Butcher, and they're really enjoyable. Um, and if I get down, which I haven't been lately, maybe I'll spend more time reading speculative fiction. So, all right. Simon says, do you think comedy is worth studying in philosophy? Can you recommend any texts on philosophy? I've read Bergson's essay on humor. Not good. Oh, that's too bad. I think it's good. Are there any comedians you particularly enjoy? As a matter of fact, I will recommend a friend and colleague of mine from graduate school, Philip Dean, who is he teaches at University of Southern University, New Hampshire, and he's written some articles on philosophy of comedy himself and humor. I mean, Aristotle talks about it in the Nicomachean Ethics, also to some degree in other works. There's, Cicero actually says some things about jokes in his On the Orator. There's like a whole literature spanning the centuries of philosophers thinking about comedy and humor. There's actually something in Schopenhauer's part one of World as Will and Representation. There's a chapter where he talks about that. So there's tons and tons of people out there, and you just kind of have to do like a search to find them. And they've all got different takes on what makes things funny. None of them, I would say, are like, the definitive take on comedy or humor. But, there's lots of stuff. What is really funny, though, is that some of the discussions of comedy humor are themselves so serious and not funny. So yeah. All right. Ruhan says, I've been wanting to get into Jean Hippolyte's book, Logic and Insistence. I want to know if you recommend his interpretation of Hegel. Um, yeah, Hippolyte is reliable, I would say, right? Um, I have on the shelf back there his Genesis and Structure of Hegel's phenomenology. And, when I was in graduate school, I actually photocopied Hippolyte's translation in 2 volumes because my mentor, who specialized in French philosophy, had put all these annotations in it. I've probably got those around here somewhere. You know, we used to photocopy books way back in the day before we had PDFs of everything. And, Hippolyte is probably not going to steer you too wrong. Like with Kojève, who's his contemporary, you're getting Kojève's Hegel, right? With Hippolyte, there's a bit more like, I'm not going to intrude my own ideas in there, So, all right. John says, any advice on a good place to start when reading Husserl? As a matter of fact, I do have 2 things. Again, things when I um, introduce beginners to Husserl. So the Cartesian Meditations, right? That's a set of lectures that he gave to a kind of general audience, and it's giving you an idea about what he's doing. But Husserl also, a lot of people don't know this, wrote an article on phenomenology for the Encyclopedia Britannica, and he's telling you what he thinks phenomenology is, and where it's supposed to be headed in that. So that's a great place as well. And when I've taught Husserl in the past, which I don't do very often, those are the texts that I've given my students. Oso says, an AMA or 2 ago, you gave me suggestions for exploring Camus' influences. I want to say thanks for the guidance. It's been great, but difficult reading so far. Oh, that's good. Yeah, it's always nice to check back in, right? Tarek says, will we see a possible Nietzsche sessions soon? I don't know what you mean by Nietzsche sessions. So I do, if you're asking, like, am I shooting videos on Nietzsche? Not right now. Although I do intend to do another of those fake quotes videos, one on Nietzsche, because a lot of people come up with stuff that Nietzsche didn't say and attribute it to him. But I don't know what you mean by a Nietzsche session. Are you asking about an online class or something? Because I am planning a online class in the Study with Sadler Academy down the line, probably in fall, on Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy and Genealogy of Morals, his 2 most systematic works. Max says, don't have a question, but I wanted to thank you for the self-directed study on Kant. Your tip of occasionally taking a step break helps with reading the, in my opinion, semi-overlooked second critique. Yeah, the second critique doesn't, and actually the third critique don't get as much love as the first critique do, but Kant clearly thought they were important. And I think that they're, in a lot of respects, more interesting than the first critique myself. And, with Kant, the idea of, like, every once in a while stepping back and taking a break rather than simply plowing through it. This would apply to Hegel too, and Heidegger and other difficult thinkers as well. Tarek says you would love to read Paradise Lost. I've already read Paradise Lost. I've actually tutored students on it in the past. Shelley says I was thinking of rereading Waiting for Godot. I did a paper on it. I found it kind of disappointing. It was one of those texts that, I get where it's coming from. It had been talked up so much as being so cool and you needed to read it. And I was a little disappointed when I did read it. 30 years ago as an undergraduate. Um, Lapse 9 Continuum says, I have a girlfriend who I love unconditionally. Sometimes it seems serendipitous. We found each other at all. What would you say to someone who worries they might never find the right person? Well, I would say um, you might not ever find the right person, but that doesn't mean that you can't find a person who doesn't suit you in many respects. We don't all necessarily have soulmates. I'm lucky enough to have found mine, but you know, I also found people who I wrongly thought could be that person in the past. And we don't all have to have like the best, romance in the world, just like we don't all have to have a career. Sometimes it's enough to have a job. So that's probably not that consoling if somebody really is invested in, oh, I've got to find the perfect person for myself. Um, but, if that's bothering somebody, maybe they want to think about where they got the idea that they have to find that one person from and whether it's a good idea or not. Um, Aman says, which book is best for the basics of philosophy? There is no book that's best for the basics of philosophy. There aren't bests in general in philosophy. And if there are bests, they're not going to be bests across the board. They're going to be best for this kind of person or that kind of person. You know, um, it works that way pretty much for all the humanities. There aren't bests like that. And people who tell you that there are mistaken and probably leading you astray, or they're like, making up lists to make some money on websites. Um, Christophius, I'm a medical student. Is there any text you recommend on philosophy of medicine, psychiatry, especially? Not an area that I specialize in, so um, there's really no helpful advice that I could give you about that. Essayist, what do you think of Bob Brandam's version of inferentialism and his philosophy in general? It's cool that you're on a first name basis with good old Bob, right? I'm not, I call him Robert myself. But I don't know. I haven't read a ton of Brandam's stuff. I've liked the stuff that I've read, but I'm not like somebody who works on him. Um, I don't know his version of inferentialism. I can't say much about his philosophy in general, other than to say that he's a good example of somebody who starts out doing analytic philosophy, but because he actually cares about getting the thinkers right and reads widely, ends up becoming more of a history of philosophy person in the good sense than just a straight out analytic philosopher. But I mean, there's like hundreds and hundreds of philosophers out there who are big names right now. And you can't stay on top of all of these people. So, all right. Let's see here. Vector says, I think more effort, investigation, priority, and initiative should be enforced to find the lost works of Stoicism. What's your thoughts on this? And will we ever find them in our lifetime? And who's trying? I mean, I don't know what you think people would do. First of all, it should be enforced. Who the hell's going to enforce it? The philosophy Grand Council, the philosophy police, the Grand Poobah of Stoicism. There isn't any such thing, right? I mean, I don't know what you think people would do. And then where the hell are you going to find these texts? I mean, in the past, where we found texts are in old libraries, very often sandwiched in between other texts, or we might luck out and there's a cache of texts that somehow got preserved in dry conditions in the Middle East, and then somebody sold them and they were found. And this is more like thinking about the Dead Sea Scrolls or stuff like that, but you don't find that sort of stuff very often, and we've probably found as much as we're going to. I don't know who you think would be like carrying out a kind of Indiana Jones antiquities sort of thing, finding the lost stuff. Um, you know, Maybe we'll find some of the stuff as they're deciphering the scrolls at Herculaneum, but we don't know. I mean, a lot of that looks like it's Epicurean stuff, which is cool to have our hands on, but we don't know what that person actually had in their library. So, prospects of it are pretty dim. That said, there's enough Stoic literature already in existence that most people don't bother to actually read, that you can keep pretty busy for a while doing that. Again, I'm teaching this class that I'll probably offer again in the fall after Stoicon and Stoic Week on Stoicism and the cardinal virtues. And we're like looking at the references to virtues and the breakdown of them in this wide range of texts that are available. And most of the people that are studying them are encountering some of these for the first time. So, all right. Let's see here. Simon says, Socrates said, oh, it was about Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living. Yeah, I mean, he said something kind of like that. That's kind of a paraphrase, but yeah. Tarek says, I watched your videos on Stoic philosophy of Epictetus. Have you considered reading about ancient Greek poetry, such as Sappho? A lot of recommendations for stuff that I would enjoy reading that I've already read in my time. I'm 53 years old, started college when I was 20. I have read quite a bit of stuff than just the things I've done videos on. I went through a Greek lyric poetry phase and read a lot of the stuff that was available. And yeah, Sappho's good. There's all sorts of cool things that we could do, but I, only have so much time. Shelley says, I would like to be Stoic, but I can't do it in practice. Well, that's kind of a strange assumption to make. And you're probably being a little bit too perfectionist about it when you're making that clearly ungrounded judgment. You don't have to be all the way Stoic. Nobody starts out there. You start incorporating some practices and you see where they get you. If it only helps you out in one way, that's fine. And you could do that with studying Aristotelianism or Epicureanism or whatever you want, right? So, all right. Let's see. Vector says, how do the Stoics solidify judgments about things good, evil, and indifferent as a type of self-dialectic or logic? Please elaborate on how they do this. I don't know what you mean by logic, so I can't say yes or no to that because logic means a lot of different things. The Stoics give you all sorts of advice about how to do that. Read Seneca, read Epictetus, read Marcus Aurelius to a lesser extent. I mean, Epictetus breaks things down for you and says, here's the way to look at things. In this situation, pay attention to this. Those are the ways that you actually solidify your judgments about things good, evil, and indifferent. Seneca does even more because we've got lots more of his writings, so I don't need to elaborate on it because I think you can probably go into the text and start gleaning all sorts of great ideas about that. Earl says, I appreciate you sharing your interests, especially music and heavy metal. What's a philosophical approach to its benefits to society, especially given doubts on the virtues of its content and proximity to deviant behavior beyond raw catharsis? Oh, with heavy metal, right? So, you can look at scientific studies that are out there that show that people who are like fans of heavy metal, listening to heavy metal actually calms them down rather than making them aggressive. There's, how scientific, I'm always taking this stuff with somewhat of a grain of salt, but there's people doing research on that. And it's not just about catharsis. It's, sometimes about guiding your life. And yeah, you can find plenty of heavy metal songs that are hedonistic or, about occult matters, but you can also find great ideas in heavy metal songs. For example, and, Megadeth's Peace Sells, but who's buying? One of my favorite lines ever in a heavy metal song. If there's a new way, I'll be the first in line, but it better work this time, right? that encapsulates a whole pragmatic attitude about change and, holding people accountable and stuff like that. So, there's all sorts of interesting directions we could go with that. Um, all right. Shelley says, do philosophers even agree? Yeah, of course they do. I mean, otherwise you couldn't have schools of philosophy. Those are people who are in agreement with each other. If you're asking, do all philosophers agree on something? That's a silly thing to ask for because it's never happened, and it doesn't happen in any of the other humanities either. All right. Vector, there isn't enough Stoic literature. We're missing too much. Don't complain about what you don't have. Focus on what you do have. I doubt that you've actually read through the available Stoic literature. So until you've done that, and not just once, but multiple times, don't complain about what we don't have. Um, so Jeffrey says, do you work out? I do. I like to take walks and lift weights and do cardio and stuff like that. Been doing a lot of those things for quite a long time. All right. Tariq says, I was always wondering about how you're able to enrich so much in your vocabulary skills. Any book recommendations? No, the way you build your vocabulary is not by reading a particular book. It's by reading books, by reading authors. The more that you read and the better stuff that you're reading, the more you are building up networks of stuff within your mind that help you to develop a vocabulary. I mean, it wouldn't hurt to go and look up things in the dictionary sometimes as well. And by the way, French, I had a leg up with French because my mom and her family are French Canadian and spoke some French at home. So I learned some basic French. But the thing that really probably helped me the most, I got my hands on, actually, my mom bought it for me on one of her trips to Paris. She got me the gigantic the Robert dictionary, which is, French. And so when I would read a French text and I would not know a word, I would look it up in the dictionary and then I would read the page or so about it. Right. And maybe I might not know all of those words, and some of them I might look up as well. And you build your vocabulary in really great ways that way. So that can be helpful. Essayist has a good question to answer here. Would you agree that in order to understand a philosophical text, you have to read it only in the original language? What do you think about the translatability of philosophy in general? There isn't a translatability of philosophy in general, and there aren't answers to those sort of questions. There's how well can you translate Hegel? How well can you translate Descartes? How well can you translate Aristotle? And they're very, very different things. There's no philosophy in general. And this purist, elitist idea that you must read it in the original or you're not doing any good, that's silly. I mean, how the hell would you know that to begin with? Unless you actually have all these languages at your disposal and you've read all these texts in the original. I mean, where did this idea come from that, you must read it in the original? I mean, there's good translations out there. And if you can read something in the original, you go back and forth from your native language to the Greek or Latin or whatever it's going to be. I mean, Rene Descartes, it's up on the high shelf there. The Meditations was written in Latin. He didn't even translate it into French. If you're reading the Meditations in French, you're not reading the original because you didn't read the Latin original. However, the French text has things in it that the Latin text doesn't. We want to avoid these kind of silly generalizations like this. And, the idea that you absolutely, in order to understand at all a philosophical text, you have to read it in the original. Well, then why do we translate anything? I mean, some of these things you really got to think about. All right. Pay Taxes says, have you ever read The Philosophy of Freedom by Rudolf Steiner? No, I've never read that, although I've read other Steiner stuff, and frankly, I'm not impressed. I actually knew quite a few anthroposophists. I've been to the Gudianum in Dortnacht in Switzerland, and so, I can talk pretty competently about Steiner and anthroposophy. And, it's a cult, basically, when you get down to it. A fairly benign one as far as they go, but it's, you know, it's some weird, wacky stuff. Um, Simon says, if someone is opposed to modern forms of therapy, what alternatives are there for them? I know Foucault criticizes aspects of modern psychiatry, but what alternatives are there? So it's funny that you bring up Foucault and then modern forms of therapy, and the modern forms are cognitive behavior therapy and dialectical behavior therapy, because Foucault did not have those in mind at all. What Foucault was thinking about was the French establishment of his time, and what would that consist in? Primarily psychoanalysis, wasn't it? As it was in Britain and the United States for a while too. The whole cognitive thing comes much later. And so you're kind of mixing apples and oranges there. And why are you opposed to cognitive behavior therapy? I mean, it's not a cure all for everything, but think about why you're actually opposed to it. And then you've got some reasons that you might be able to use to figure out what other alternatives you would go to. But to dismiss it just offhand seems kind of imprudent to me. Vector says, what's your IQ? My IQ is the kind that says that people who are interested in IQ are dummies. I haven't had an IQ test since I was a kid. I'm not going to give you the number because it was, kind of immaterial, and then people will use it for comparison. But I think that people who think in terms of IQ have a certain kind of stupidity that whatever number they have, I'm not going to trust them with anything important, and I don't take them seriously. Mark says, I've recently been reading into the history of student protests here in South Africa. Accessibility, obviously a major concern. What are your thoughts on free education, especially basic versus higher? Oh, I would love to see. I think that if we could provide free education, and there's certainly nothing in theory preventing that from happening, then we should do that. It should become something like a human right, certainly K through 12, and maybe even university education. In the developed world, we certainly have the resources that if we arrange the economy differently, we could have like things where not everybody can go because they're not suited for this sort of school or something like that. We could have qualifications, but we could certainly spend some of the money that we piss away on other stupid things on education and make it, very, very affordable for anybody who desires it. That would be pretty awesome. All right. Let's see. It just skipped a little bit. Subin, do you think at the end of our lives we will come to terms with everything that happened and find peace? Depends on who you are and how screwed up you are, and whether you've, done horrible things that are going to prevent you from doing that, or whether you've been a good person. There's no answer to that covers everybody. Probably the answer is think about what would be needed for you to find peace at the end, if that's something that matters to you, and then start doing those things, right? If you got like long-standing grudges and beefs with people that you're going to hold on to while you're dying, you're probably going to have a crappy death. If you've alienated all your friends and family, you might want to like figure out how to rebuild those relationships. So that's a good one in part, right? Let's see. Sunny says, how are you finding your volunteering and almost home cat rescue of late? I was moved by your reflective piece on Medium, The Paradox of Care. Oh, good. Help me to come to terms with the loss of my own. Yeah. So I enjoy volunteering at Almost Home. So for those of you who don't know, a little bit of backstory. When my wife and I got together, she had a whole four-legged family. She had adopted two kittens who were about 8 years old when I met them, Sassy and Teensy, and they were the survivors of an apartment fire in New York City. Then subsequently, she adopted two puppies, uh, 1 year, one the other year. There was Magnus, who'd been pretty terribly abused. And then there was Amika, who is a Katrina puppy. So all four of these, live together. I'm a animal lover, and I'm not a dog or a cat person, although more of a cat person these days, I'd say. And I became friends with all of them. Some it took longer. Sassy and I became friends immediately. Magnus and I pretty quickly, and Amika, and then Teensy took a bit more time. And Teensy unfortunately died when she was only 12, so then it was just the three, and then we moved here to Milwaukee, and then Magnus died, and then Amika died, and then it was just Sassy, and Sassy and I became very, very close. She's the animal that I've bonded the closest with in all my life. And we would do all sorts of things together. You may have seen pictures of me taking her out for walks or having me on my shoulder and doing all sorts of things, feeding her. She'd like to eat my food. She liked to eat everybody's food, actually. And so when Sassy died, and we're coming up to about 2 years of her being dead in April, I had thought, okay, when she goes, I will start volunteering in some sort of animal shelter to help out with other cats. That way I can, spend time with cats, and they can get some benefit by having somebody who likes them and is attentive and all that. But I didn't do that right away. And then we were in Green Bay, not for a Packers game, but weirdly enough for a soccer game, because they do this kind of exchange program where I don't whatever league it was, maybe European League or Premier League. They were playing over in Green Bay, so we were up there for a weekend, and we were downtown, and we walked past this cat refuge, cat shelter, and my wife Andy said, "Hey, do we want to go in?" And I was like, I don't know. This is like 3 months maybe after Sassy died. And then we walked past it again, and Andy was like, let's go in. Let's go check it out. So we go in, we're talking with the people, and it turns out it's a shelter for cats that have special needs or who are terminally ill. And they take in other cats as well. And there's a guy who you can actually research and look up. There's articles on him. He takes naps with the cats. He's a volunteer there. He's a retired guy. And he introduced me to this little cat named Agnes, who had cancer. She was about maybe 11 or so. And so I sat on the couch, and Agnes sat in my lap, and I petted her, and she fell asleep in my lap. And, after that, I was like, yeah, maybe this is something I want to do. And then, we went to a local cat cafe for my birthday. That also works with shelter cats. And then I found out about Almost Home. So we went in, and back then it was just Ernest and Maxine, two FIV positive cats who were there in the shelter. They had others out in fosters. And, I was like, oh, this is really good. I like doing this. So I started coming on weekends. And then after a while, I was like, I think I want to volunteer here. And so I started doing that, and I really do enjoy it. It's a lot of fun to hang out with them. You see a lot of them come and go. I work with the ones that are kind of shy or withdrawn or afraid, and just spend gentle time with them. And you see them come out of their shell and become social. And I also work with, there was one who I bonded with a lot, Rosie. She was a naughty cat. She was dominant. And so I would give her plenty of attention. And she got adopted, and you get to see all these cats get adopted, right? And that's, kind of important. You feel sometimes a little sad when they go, but they're going on to a good home, and you're happy that you were able to give them love, and go back to the question of kindness and attention, and you made some little impact on their life. So I think that's For me, quite good. There are some volunteers there who get kind of conflicted, not because the cats are going, but they would like to do more and more and more. And there's always going to be cats, and we can say this about people in need, but you can, you know, you can only do so much. And so that's what I do. So, all right, Green, is that Green Obino? Any thoughts on reading existential pessimism like Sharon or Zappa? If you want to do that, go ahead. If you don't. I mean, what would my thoughts be? Is it good to read them? Is it bad to read them? Is that what the question is? So, uh, uh, JB points out an important thing in practice. When it comes down to it, very few therapists are just one thing or another. They will be drawing on a bunch of modalities, some older, some newer, like internal family systems, narrative therapy. Yeah. Sabin asked, "What do you think about universal basic income?" I think if we could do that, that'd be great. It's nice because it reduces people's anxieties about being able to stay alive, provides a basic safety net, and we certainly have enough wealth in the economies in the developed world to be able to do it. The main things that prevent it are people wanting to, retain their privileges and wealth and rank and stuff like that, and quite frankly, a kind of sourness and resentment on the part of other people who are like, I don't want somebody else getting something for free, not realizing that lots of people get things for free, but it's done in kind of an arbitrary, haphazard way. So, all right. R12 something something. Do you think there's any validity in mysticism and revelation? What's validity there? Do I think that it's interesting to look at what actual people who call themselves mystics or actual revelations from particular religious traditions say? That's very interesting. Am I going to use some sort of giant abstract category of mysticism, which means a million different things to other people? No, I don't see any use in that. So, all right, Elijah, how may Hegel's philosophy of religion be useful for reinterpreting the past? Is it off base to consider applying it to accepting loss? So, two different questions. Hegel, as a historian of religions, I wouldn't rely on anything in there. Hegel, when he's doing history, is not doing any sort of real attentive history. He's trying to call out the grand idea that's in that thing, and sometimes getting things quite wrong, not just with religions, but also with previous philosophies too. So I wouldn't rely on it for that. That would be kind of silly. Could you apply it to accepting loss? Yeah, why not? I mean, I don't know why you would single out that when there's other things about loss or negativity or stuff in Hegel, and there's other people who more directly talk about loss. I'm not sure why you'd want to go to Hegel for that, but if that's what you're reading and you want to do something with that, I guess you could. There's nothing necessarily holding you back, right? All right, let's see. Oh, Andy is here. Good to see you as well. Enjoying learning about the Stoics, finding my enjoyment again. Quick question: what role does the concept of living in accordance with nature play in the practice of Stoic virtues? That's a whole can of worms, right? It's one of those catchphrases, living in accordance with nature, that means different things in different places to different Stoics, and there's a lot of different moving parts to it. So there's a couple things that you could say. One is that living in accordance with nature very early on, so by the time of Chrysippus, the third scholarch, is it's distinguished as living in accordance with the nature of the cosmos and living in accordance with the nature of human being, which means not being an asshole because people are assholes, but being a fully developed human being or as close to that as we can get. And that means cultivating the virtues and eliminating the vices. So that's part of it right there. The virtues themselves, in turn, help us to live in accordance with nature in a variety of different ways. So, for example, the Stoics think that as human beings, we have a natural social instinct, which often goes wrong. So think about tribalism, for example. I'm going to look out for my people. Screw everybody else over here. They're bad. We're good. That human natural impulse to being in groups and society can lead you to be good to some people, which is good, and then bad to other people who you shouldn't be bad to. And so the Stoics would come along and say, well, that's not justice. Here's what justice looks like. And this is where we get like Stoic cosmopolitanism from, which, by the way, is going to be the theme of this year's Stoicon, the big international conference that we have every year in October, which my friend and colleague Harold Kavli is organizing, and I'm co-organizing. So that's kind of a cool thing there. So these things kind of fit in together. You can say similar things with Stoicism in general. You got a whole constellation of ideas, and they're all connected with each other, and they mean more placed in relation to each other. All right, Bastet, why do so many people in academia support Frank Boas, the Frankfurt School of Communism, and deny racial differences in IQ? Well, because they're not fucking stupid, for one thing. I mean, racial differences in IQ, if you actually buy into that, you're an idiot. And you probably don't want to hang out here because I'll call you that, because I firmly believe it. And where did you get this idea that so many people in academia support Frank Boas or the Frankfurt School? You clearly have no idea what academia is like. Spend a little time on an actual college campus or university before saying stupid things about academia like that. Oh, okay. So now Bastiat is like writing stuff. I'm just going to remove them because they think academia is Jewish. Okay, so we got a hardcore racist there. That doesn't have any place here. It's ironic that we're talking about Stoic cosmopolitanism, and then we get some repugnant, disgusting, racist person showing up. I mean, one of the things that the Stoics actually use as an example of something that's completely indifferent, the color of a person's skin. So in ancient times, whether your skin was black or white or pink or olive, nothing to do with anything, according to the Stoics, So, yeah. All right, so let's come back. So Simon has a thing about talking to JB about in my country for low mood disorders, you almost always receive CBT. My experience with CBT wasn't great. Now I'm skeptical. So here's the thing. There's two things to think about that. Yeah, that's the case in a lot of places. You're probably going to get a CBT person because that's the big thing right now. Just like if you were back in the 50s, you'd get a psychoanalyst. There's good psychoanalysts, there's bad psychoanalysts. There's good CBT practitioners, there's bad ones. It's foolish to draw on one experience or two experiences of a modality that includes hundreds of thousands of practitioners to decide that the modality is no good. Go find yourself a better therapist who will actually work with you. And when you go in, tell them about your experience, and they might actually say, oh, that person actually got CBT wrong. I think a lot of people draw way too much about big movements or approaches from looking at only one person who practices it. All right. Let's see here. Terry Fox, favorite scholar of Hegel. I don't have favorites like that. If I want to know about Hegel, I read Hegel. I don't spend a lot of time with secondary literature. I don't. When would I have the time to spend time on a lot of secondary literature if it's not doing research directly on something I'm particularly interested in. All right, Tariq says, where will we be headed in our tech industrialization of society? It seems mental and personality disorders are doubling with advances of technology. We don't really know that. There's a lot of people who like alarmist stuff, but if you read back through history, you see that the same alarmist themes coming up every single generation with every new thing. Radio was going to destroy us for a while. Heidegger is a great example of that. Oh, I don't like the mass thing that's happening with radio. And how many of us actually listen to the radio now? The social media is going to rot our brains. I don't think so. I mean, what's more likely is that we have greater access to mental health resources and less stigma about going to therapy. So more people actually go to therapy. That doesn't mean that like technology is causing it. You'd have to show that there's some sort of correlation between the two, and that sort of stuff, that sort of social science, that's tough to do. So, all right. Let's see here. We got another wannabe racist here trying to do a little code thing. Get rid of them as well. Ken, nice to see you here. Says, worth reading Dr. Donald Robertson on the intersections between CBT and Stoicism. He's got a whole book on that. As a matter of fact, I think that that might have been the first book that he published. It's been quite a while, and I think he's done a second version of it, and he's talked quite a bit about it. We've also done some video interviews together, So I like Donald. He and I have worked together on quite a few things, and he can sometimes be a little bit too dismissive of non-cognitive approaches, but it's okay. At that point we just kind of stop the conversation and talk about other stuff. Headbutts for Fatic. What's your opinion on Kevin MacDonald's Culture of Critique? Never read him, nor have I ever read any Edward Dutton. I don't even know who that is. Do I believe in evolution? Sure. Depends on what you mean by evolution. There's a lot of different approaches to it out there. Seems pretty straightforward that species do evolve. We can actually observe, that sort of thing happening over generations with certain organisms that reproduce fairly quickly. So I take it as something that should be kind of uncontroversial. Meme Master, have you read any of the newer Oxford translations of Hegel's lectures, such as the Brown and Hodgson translations of the lectures of philosophy of history? Haven't, and probably won't. I'm happy enough with the text that I've got. It's nice that there's always people churning out new stuff, but, I don't do a lot on Hegel and the philosophy of history. If somebody wants to send me a copy, I'll read it, but that's fine. Headbutt for Fatic communism. If humans have all these years of separate evolution, they don't. So you're asking kind of a stupid question there, and I'm going to ban you too. I guess I'm not sure where we got all these racists popping in from, but stupid of them to come in because they lose access to the channel forever when they do that. Meme Master, have you read any secondary literature on Hegel? Yes, I have read some secondary literature on Hegel. We were talking about that at the start of the thing. What about Hippolyte? And I contrasted him to Kojève. So, yeah. Personally, I think forays into the scholarship is essential. Would you say this is a fault of yours? I've made forays into the scholarship. I'm willing to bet probably many more than you have. I did a lot of work on Hegel in my graduate years. And back then, spent a lot of time doing that. I've also done this thing you might have heard of called the Half-Hour Hegel series. So, presumably I might have encountered a little bit of secondary literature on Hegel. But you go ahead and think whatever you want about, uh, how important it is to make forays into the scholarship. Um, let's see here. Sabin, have you played Disco Elysium? Um, I don't even know what it is. Green Beano, I've been trying to find a good intro to virtue ethics. Is there one you would recommend? It's called the Nicomachean Ethics. If you want to actually understand virtue ethics, you read actual virtue ethicists and you participate in their, sort of world of thinking. You don't want to find an intro to virtue ethics, which is probably going to be not very good. Um, so let's see here. Michael says Bloch opposed Kierkegaard's view of angst in relating to the future. How might Bloch's interpretation of the future be put in constructive dialogue? I don't know. I'm not a Bloch person, so you'd have to ask somebody like that. Tariq, can you suggest resources in understanding Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus? It's very challenging to read. I mean, it's really not that challenging because the bulk of the book is just baby logic, right? I mean, once you get past the very beginning part where it's like the picture theory of language, and then you read the kind of, that of what you cannot speak, you must be silent, and ethics and blah, blah, blah is all, mysticism. It's all basically just intro to logic stuff. So I'm not sure why you're finding it difficult to read, and I'm not sure why you want to read it because it's not an important work. I mean, people thought it was important 50 years ago, but it's not really that important to read now. Um, let's see. Andy says, sad to see you were right about comments on YouTube. Yeah, I mean, I will say this: it's been a while since I've had a bunch of people coming in saying stupid things, but I block very ruthlessly. So when people leave stupid comments on videos and Twitter stuff and all that, I often will block them as well, and it tends to improve the channel in general because you weed out all those sort of people, and they can go play in their pig pens elsewhere. Artie, what's your thoughts on Zizek's reading of Hegel? Not much. I mean, I don't pay much attention to Zizek. I think that he did interesting work early on back in the day, but he became a star, and basically he'll just like kind of free associate stuff. I mean, he's not as bad as say Nick Land in that respect, but there's not much that's being said that I think is particularly interesting. There's lots of jargon dropping. There's not a lot of like exposition and argument the further you get on in Zizek. In the beginning, he was doing really interesting, rigorous stuff. So when I first encountered him in the 1990s, I would actually read his stuff, but I don't find him that interesting now. Um, Michael says, how do you put the Reformed tradition in dialogue with other Christian traditions? In what could the Reformed tradition contribute something worthwhile to the discussion of Christian redemption? I don't put it into dialogue because I don't have any, I don't know what it would mean for me, not a Reformed person, to put somebody else's tradition into dialogue with other traditions that I also probably don't belong to. I think you would want to ask a Reformed person that rather than me. I can tell you that when it comes to like certain things that I study, like the Christian philosophy debates of the 1930s and 40s, there was a smaller Francophone Reform debate, and there was also a Dutch Reform debate that had almost nothing to do with the French one. And the French Reformed ones were quite interesting, but they don't get read much. Paul Ricoeur, by the way, was part of that. But none of the Reformed people over here are reading those guys. If anything, they're reading, Deweyard and those Dutchies, who I don't really, pay much attention to, right? Let's see. Tarek, what are some books you're planning to read for this year? Oh, I got a whole bunch of stuff. So, Worlds of Speculative Fiction. We are going to be doing all sorts of great things. We're doing Jim Butcher this month, the Dresden files stuff that turned into a TV show. We got all sorts of other cool authors lined up. I'm probably going to read some other speculative fiction that's outside of that as well, including going back to the Malazan books, which I've really, really enjoyed. I did 2 sessions on that. I've always got other stuff in philosophy that I'm rereading or reading for the first time. So I've got lots and lots of research to do as well. Alligator, have you ever given much thought to the philosophy of death? Topics like, is death bad for us? What would immortality be like? Is suicide rational or enough? I mean, you could look in the channel and see that I've actually done quite a few videos on philosophers who talk about death. And so the answer would be yes. And we talk about it sometimes in like my intro classes or, things like that. Ethics classes, it comes up as well. So yeah, I've given plenty of thought to it. And I've thought about it myself as somebody who has dealt with a ton of death. Both my parents are dead. All my grandparents are dead. Actually, my biological parents aren't both dead. That's kind of nice that I got to know them. I lost my best friend when I was 22. Had a number of other people die. So yeah, I've given a lot of thought to it in the past. All right. Sunny says, I suspect the attention-speaking trolls we've disappointingly had to deal with may be a single person who's created multiple accounts. Yeah, let them do that. Then they just keep getting multiple accounts banned. And Rusty Roach, you can set the comments to subscribers only. I know that, but I already have things set up the way I want them. I don't require somebody to be part of the channel or a subscriber to join in on this sort of thing. It's easy enough just to hit, it's one click to ban them, forever. So, all right, R1234. Is it true that all of Western philosophy leads back to the idealism or materialism of Plato and Aristotle? No, it is not true. And here's a sort of word of advice. Any generalization about all of Western philosophy is probably going to be wrong. And when you have something like that and you're like, ooh, maybe there's some truth to this, you always want to read a bit more. If you want to know about ancient philosophy, read ancient philosophy, and then that would answer your question for you. You notice that in Plato, you've already got like Plato's discussing people before him, right? And so is Aristotle. And there's Plato and Aristotle aren't the only thinkers out there. Shortly after them, Epicurus is on the scene, right? Doing something different. And then we get Plato's school takes a skeptical turn, and skeptics are not the same thing as Plato or Aristotle, right? So anytime you've got these massive generalizations, and somebody is telling you them, that person either is ignorant or is on the make or is doing something, right, that is trying to put forth a false and oversimplified idea about philosophy. And you want to ask yourself, why are they doing that? And why should I be paying attention to them? Simon says, I notice you don't often subscribe to systematic explanations of things, and you're good at avoiding generalizations. Have you always been that way, or did it come with age? Well, I do have systematic explanations of things. It's just that they don't just come from one school. I'm an eclectic, sort of like Cicero, who I find a kindred spirit in in that respect, as does, by the way, we did a whole conversation about this, Massimo Pigliucci, right? Um, does some of it come with age? Yeah, maybe, because, if you've ever looked at my philosophical development videos, I talk about going through phases like a Sartre phase and a Nietzsche phase and a Wittgenstein phase, you know, and then you're like, oh, I see the whole world through this person. And inevitably I've found I don't get what I fully need from that person, and that person often got some people wrong or left some things out that I want to go back to and check out. So yeah, I also think that the more that you read and study, the wider you read and study in philosophy, the less generalizations you can make about philosophy as such. You're always like, well, that's cool about Aristotelian philosophy, or that's cool about Descartes and the Cartesians, or things like that, right? But you kind of specify, because it's sort of like with people talking about cooking. All cuisine is based on these three principles. Well, no, it isn't. All traditions of cuisine boil down to either the French or the Chinese. Well, no, that's not the case at all. I mean, if we transpose these ideas into other areas, we can see how ridiculous they sound. I only do French cuisine. And you'd be like, well, what about this dish that the French got from the Italians and then put their own twist on? You know, um, it's not quite so simple as that, right? Uh, Biniac, do you still read Lacan, or is the phase really over? Of course, I still read Lacan. I've actually got the Écrit right here, and my favorite work by him, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. Um, but I didn't have a Lacanian phase. I'm not sure where you got that from. I've published a few things here and there on Lacan, so clearly, if I did have a phase, publishing those things after the phase would be a little bit weird, wouldn't it? Lapse 9 continuing. Speaking of Heidegger, I've always been a little unclear about the way Heidegger seems to associate present at hand entities with mathematics. Would love to get your take on it. Well, he doesn't associate it with mathematics as such, and he doesn't associate all present at hand things with the mathematizable, or the stuff that can be quantified. But and a lot of it has to do with like the tendency in late modern life to reduce things. This is in the question concerning technology, to standing reserve, to things that we can turn into quantities that we can logistically plan and move around and stuff like that. That's basically the connection there. He's not saying that everything is mathematics in some weird quasi Pythagorean or weird Neoplatonist way. So all right, JB says, I've gotten a lot of good laughs out of today. Don't love the racists showing up, but enjoy them getting shown up. Yeah. Now, Shelley has an interesting question. Is the philosophy of Schopenhauer depressing to read? Not at all. Because first of all, with any philosopher, you don't have to actually accept what they're saying. So if you're reading a pessimistic philosopher, that doesn't mean that by reading them, you have to accept everything they're saying and then become a pessimist yourself, and then find the cure in reading an optimist philosopher. You can read Aristotle without becoming an Aristotelian, or Rene Descartes' Meditations without, worrying about an evil demon who's deceiving you yourself. But Schopenhauer is also a great writer. I mean, this is one area where he really does stand out, especially by contrast to the one person who he's such a jerk about, which is Hegel. I mean, I don't like reading Schopenhauer's criticisms of Hegel because he's basically just being a dick, and he had that tendency about him, as his mother points out in her letter to him. And he was particularly a jerk because Hegel got him his job, and he seemed to have been motivated by envy and malice, which his own philosophy thinks is a bad thing, right? But he's certainly a great writer. He's clear, he's got good style in both translation and in the original. And you can't say that about Hegel, and you can't even say that about Kant either. I mean, Kant has got really interesting ideas, but he's not a joy to read. Whereas Schopenhauer, you can really enjoy reading him, I think. Um, so, all right. Um, Luke says, how would you help someone move on from a phase or favorite hobby horse? I wouldn't. Um, I don't view it as my job to help people move on from a phase. They need to figure out that what they're having a phase about, however enthusiastic they are about it, isn't going to be enough for them. And you know, I don't think that I need to rush that in people. Instead, they have to realize for themselves, I'm not getting what I want out of this person or this approach or this point of view. I mean, like take, say, for example, being a Nietzschean. If you do spend a lot of time with Nietzsche, there's a tendency to get kind of jerky with other people and oh, I'm an Ubermensch or stuff like that. But you know, if you don't like other people not liking you, maybe that'll help you shift out of that phase, right? Or if you're like a weird kind of Platonist and you're like everything's crap except for the ideal, well, that's not going to last you that long. I mean, you can lose yourself in contemplation of the forms, but I don't know too many people out there doing that. All right, so let's see here. Laps 9 Continuum says, always makes me laugh a little when Schopenhauer calls Kant a scoundrel. Yeah, especially when he likes Kant so much, too. Green Obino, Schopenhauer was a breakthrough for me, helped me get into that era of philosophy. Glad to hear others enjoy him. Yeah, I mean, he's good. There's lots of other great people around that time that are worth reading. The 19th century is full of wonderful philosophers to read. Artie, what is your plan after you complete the 30-minute Hegel videos? I don't know, I'll go back in time like what 6 months when I completed the whole series, I guess. I mean, you do know the half hour Hegel series ended quite a while ago with the last video on paragraph 808. So, are you asking what I'm planning to do with a similar sort of approach? I'm doing Anselm's Proslogion and then Rene Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. I've already done Epictetus' Enchiridion with that same sort of approach. Did that back in 2017, I think. Um, so, I'm going to do those. Probably try to do some um, crowdfunding for those as well. And then I'll think about another big book. I think the next big book, sort of like the phenomenology that I'd probably want to do would be like Sartre's Being and Nothingness, which would be enjoyable because Sartre is also a good writer, which Hegel isn't. So, um, Shelley says, what's wrong with having a phase? Isn't that like a hobby, something you enjoy to do? Yeah, I mean, it's not like a hobby because you're saying that this is where I'm gonna like rest for now, and so you're depriving yourself of getting into other stuff. It might be worth doing, but there's nothing wrong with a phase as such. I mean, there's actually some good points about it. If you're obsessed with a particular philosopher, you read all their stuff and you think the world through it, right? And that's good to do that sort of thing. But I mean, do you want to remain in a phase forever? Probably not. Um, let's see here. Oh, Bignac, do you think there's parallels between the Kantian sublime and Lacan's idea of the thing? Yeah, and parallels, no. Connections, sure. I mean, read Lacan. Lacan actually talks about the thing and references Kant. Again, one of the places to go with that, ethics of psychoanalysis, right? But we also shouldn't be like obsessed with, these words and categories. Ooh, the thing. Ooh, that sort of thing. You got to be able to explain what the meaning and point of it all is. And this is where a lot of people interested in continental philosophy, I think, kind of go wrong. Sabin says, do people joke about you looking like Plato due to your physique? No, I think in part because very few people actually know much about Plato in our culture to begin with. And when they think about him, they think about him as a philosopher and as an old guy because of the painting. And they don't think about, Plato means broad. It was a nickname. Hey, big guy is basically what our English equivalent of it would be. And I do sometimes get, hey, big guy from people, but it's not connected to Plato at all. I suppose I'm starting to look more like him as my hair goes white and my beard gets white and stuff like that, right? But I don't think there's enough cultural awareness of Plato to make that work. Green Obino, what's the difference between analytic and continental philosophy? There is no a difference. There's a whole series of differences. And analytic philosophy hasn't remained the same over time. Continental philosophy was never one thing. It was always at least 3 or 4 different tendencies that blur into each other. So there's no answer to that question. Alligator, does social media challenge our relationships to the dead, such as memorialized digital remains, such as Facebook, or a digital reanimation where the deceased continue to act with the living? I don't see that as challenging our relationships to the dead. I see that as affording us the possibility of relationships, at least to our memories of the dead, right? But why would it challenge? What is our relationship to the dead? You mean like they stay dead and we don't think about them at all, you know? And then you see like somebody's Facebook page has memorialized them, and now you're stuck thinking about your dead uncle or something. I don't know that matters that much. I've actually been giving some thought to what's going to happen to like my channel, if I should happen to die. I haven't put together like a digital will at this point. I need to get onto that. But I also think about like what's going to happen to all these books, I know some people would like them, but how do we distribute them or anything like that, right? So let's see. Luke says sometimes someone close to you gets into a phase where they spend a lot of time with a guru when they might benefit from moving on. Yeah, now a guru is a different thing, right? If somebody's like, oh, I love Jordan Peterson, that's not like having a Plato phase, oh, I can't watch enough Sam Harris. He's so wonderful. Well, that's not quite the same thing as getting into the Stoics or Nietzsche. One is kind of up here and rich and has a lot of interesting things. The other is kind of down here and is basically looking to make money off of you and get clout and things like that. So gurus are a little bit of a different matter with that. Carlos says, have you heard about the Brazilian thinker Olavo de Carvalho? I've heard of him, haven't read him, so I don't have a think about him sort of thing because I don't know enough to actually say. Oh, so Shelley brings up a different thing with respect to dead people. So not in social media as such, but in movies, we have actors still living on Star Wars, actors who are dead, with their images being used. And interestingly, when we had the actors and I think it was writers' strike as well recently, one of the sticking points was whether a person's images could be used by the studios to generate CGI content of them doing things that the actor, him or herself, wasn't being paid to do and hadn't done themselves. So like using, essentially what we call deep fakes, right? these are deep fakes, but in movies or TV shows. And the actors rightly were like, well, that should be off limits, right? Because um, you're essentially ripping us off. You're taking us and using our likeness. And I think there's something worth thinking about there. I mean, right now it's not very good. By the way, they've done this in music. There was an attempt to have like a hologram of Ronnie James Dio, one of the greatest singers and band leaders in the history of heavy metal, also a brilliant guy if you've ever watched his interviews. Um, they tried having a hologram of him on stage with other musicians, live musicians, and it just did not go well, you know. And do we want to see those sorts of things? Um, Earl asks, would you have thoughts on Cornel West's writings, maybe those on pragmatism? How about his broader work, politics, and recent presidential campaign? I mean, I think of West as second rate and kind of a joke. He was a big deal when, and especially in American philosophy, because remember, I went to Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, which was one of the few places in the United States where classical American philosophy, including pragmatism, was still very well represented in the department. And so he was a big deal in the 1990s. And I always considered his stuff kind of weak, never really took him that seriously, thought he was more about showmanship than other stuff. And, you know, him coming out to be a presidential candidate, if he wants to do that, go ahead. But I don't think too many people actually do take him seriously. The people who do take him seriously are usually kind of second rate themselves, unfortunately, you know. So Simon says, is contempt in itself ever an appropriate response to certain people? Should it really be used to build upon the channel, express something else? I think anybody can feel whatever the hell they want, you know. Um, and you know, contempt means, you know, looking down upon, thinking less of. There's probably some people we should think less of. I think we should think less of racists. They choose to be racists, you know. That's an investment on their part. They don't have to be that way. Nobody's born that way. So certainly better than taking them out back and, you know, beating the crap out of them, isn't it? It's pretty minor to hold them up to ridicule or stuff like that. So I'm perfectly fine with that. And you know, you look at how they treat other people, they kind of get the same thing, right? Biniac, do you listen to any contemporary metal bands? A few, not an awful lot. I would say my favorite one, unfortunately, is that right now seems to be broken up, and that would be Orchid, the doom metal band. I just love their stuff. Somebody described them as they play the songs that Black Sabbath never got around to recording, and I think that's so accurate. There's a lot of older metal bands that, you know, are still out touring. Saxon, Uriah Heep, and Judas Priest are on tour together right now, which would be an amazing show to go to. But they're classic bands, right? They're not newer, younger bands. Although some of the parts are, right. You look at Judas Priest, you've got um, Rob Halford and Ian Hill, both in their 70s. And then you've got Scott Travis on drums. You've got Richie Faulkner and Andy Sneap on guitar, younger guys in their 40s. Amazing shows, right? Saxon has swapped out a couple parts. Uriah Heep has a couple younger guys in it, but also some older guys as well. So, you know, some of these could be viewed as like kind of contemporary bands, right? Alligator, who's your favorite heavy metal guitarist from a British band? Well, that's a tough one. I mean, probably Dave Murray from Iron Maiden. Although it's tough with guys like that, right? You got Dave Murray and Adrian Smith, and they really, you know, they fuse together. I mean, there's Yannick Gers off on the side as well, but those two guys are the real core of the classical stuff. But there's so many great guitarists out there, right? It would be easier to say who's your favorite heavy metal bassist from a British band, and that would be the same band, Steve Harris of Iron Maiden, right? But I also really like Jimmy Bain, and he's not British. He's Scott. Well, he is British because Scotland's part of Britain. Jimmy Bain is. I'm a real fan of him. Unfortunately, he's dead. Um, Ian Hill, I like quite a bit. We could talk about others as well. Catmandu, are there any interesting good pop philosophers like Zizek, Cornell, Chomsky, other than Gregory B. Sadler? I don't know that I'm a pop philosopher that like they are. Um, there's a lot of great people who do really good, accessible philosophy. I'd talk about my colleague John Sellers. He does a lot of great history of philosophy that ordinary people read. He's approachable. I mean, Alistair McIntyre's still out there and kicking, and I would trade him against all three of those guys, Zizek, Cornell, and Chomsky. Um, he's great. He's also somebody who's got great respect for the ordinary person. um, but there's tons and tons of people doing interesting work that could be called pop philosophy. They're just not getting the notoriety that people like Cornell or Zizek or Chomsky are getting. Laps 9 Continuum. Are you a fan of Merciful Fate at all? They have some of my favorite guitar parts in all of metal. I like them, but I wouldn't say that they're like, in my top 10. But, I listen to them sometimes. I mean, if you had to ask me like who are your really favorite bands, so I don't have a favorite. If you'd asked me when I was 16, Iron Maiden, right? Um, if you'd asked me when I was 26, who would it have been? Probably Alice in Chains or Helmet, you know. Um, if you ask me now, I'll say like, well, Iron Maiden and Judas Priest and Black Sabbath and Deep Purple are in there, and Dio and all the bands that he's been in, and the Scorpions. And then, where do we go from there? Well, is Raven in there? Sometimes they are. So Tank, sometimes, you know. Rat is definitely probably one of my favorite American bands. Van Halen before Van Hagar. All of these sorts of things. Well, what about the thrash guys? Well, I liked Metallica early on, but quit listening after And Justice for All. And then, Megadeth, I still like them. Never got into Slayer. Anthrax is kind of back and forth. There's other bands as well, Except I listen to a lot, and we could go on and on and on, but it's sort of like a penumbra of different things, right? So, all right, JB says, if you don't like pop philosopher, which makes sense to me, what about philosophy communicator, as people similarly situated in science tend to go by? Oh, that's a really intriguing idea, actually. I like that. That's a great idea. You're right. People in science are using that term. We should be using that for philosophy. That's a really interesting idea. So we're getting a little bit over time, and I'm going to have a event that I got to go to, so I'm going to have to wrap it up soon. So I'll take one I think I haven't had before. Isaac, how do you regard Aquinas' 5 ways? Do you think any of them are sound? I mean, it depends on what you want an argument for the existence of God to do, right? Now, sound has the technical meaning and logic of the premises are true. So you'd have to go through and put them into like some sort of logical notation to say whether they're sound or not. Um, I'm not a huge fan of cosmological arguments. I kind of agree with Hegel that arguments for the existence of God are less to like convince somebody irrevocably and irresistibly with the force of reason, and they're more like expositions of people's conceptions of what God is. So. But when I teach them as if they're plausible to undergraduates, and some of them seem to like it. Black Prairie says, what do you think of black metal? or what genres of metal do you think are pretentious or nonsensical? So I'm assuming Black Prairie thinks black metal is pretentious or nonsensical. I'm a big fan of Venom, but what Venom called black metal is very different than what black metal turned into. And I'm just, when it comes to like genre metal, the genres I'm more into are predictably enough power metal, the new wave of traditional heavy metal, doom metal, and prog metal, I guess we would say, right? So, um, yeah, I mean, I don't listen to a lot of genre metal stuff. And younger people, younger metal fans, I think, come at metal and its history coming through like, all that differentiation that happened in the 90s. Oh, I'll say thrash too. Thrash is another genre, although thrash and speed is a little tricky to say exactly where they begin and end. But um, yeah, so I think because of when I was born and the way I grew up, I come at metal from the 70s and 80s and then see all these different like going off in this direction. And I just didn't follow in most of those directions. When people were like getting into all the different genres of metal, I was getting into alternative music and grunge and stuff like that. And I was still playing, like when I played bass, for example, in college and bands, I played a lot of Iron Maiden and Metallica and AC/DC and Judas Priest and Black Sabbath and stuff like that. And then I also played a lot of Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Stone Temple Pilots and Alice in Chains and things like that. I wasn't like following along these when I played the Violent Femmes and I played, New Model Army and things like that. So, all right. Well, I am going to wrap up here. I'll take Gilbert's thing. Um, uh, Robert Paul Wolff has stated the key to understanding Kant is through the subjective deduction. What does he mean? Not a clue, because I don't watch Wolff, and I don't think there is any key to understanding Kant. I think there's a bunch of different keys depending on what part of understanding Kant we're talking about. Are we talking about the theoretical, critique of pure reason stuff? Are we talking about the moral philosophy stuff? Are we talking about the critique of judgment? These are different sides of Kant's stuff, and there's no key to doing all of them. So, all right. So I'm going to wrap up here. Thanks to everybody for joining in. We do these every month. Got a lot of other events. There's things happening every Saturday. I got classic metal class, which you got to sign up for the free online class to get in on. If you want to do that, we've got Worlds of Speculative Fiction. We got a new self-directed study video that'll be coming out towards the end of the month on Thomas Aquinas, and we're doing continuing on with Understanding Anger 2.0. We'll be talking about Cicero. So maybe I'll see you at some of these other events. Otherwise, I'll see you later on.